No, thank you very much, VJ, well, and also thank you to the panelists and everybody that's following this event. I think it's a very important event in itself. Also happening on the day of a campaign against nuclear proliferation itself. And just in a few days, on the 1st of October, China will celebrate its 71st anniversary as the founding of the People's Republic of China. Well, as you know, I'm from South Africa, and I think our experience is also part of the African continent, and we recognize that there are others from the continent who are here who will speak to those issues, but allow us to make the point that in our analysis of a potential hybrid war against China, propelled by the United States, we think it's an intra-imperialist war, meaning that, well, both the US and European imperialists are very intent on seeking to exploit the resources of the African continent, at least for our experience. And these rivalries play themselves out in many facets on the African continent. The European former colonialists continue to maintain a dominant presence in West Africa and in Central Africa. They have also been engaging, supporting civil wars in these areas and created a situation of civil war in these parts of the African continent itself. The EU, with its partnership agreements, continue to perpetuate an uneven trajectory of trade development on the African continent that favors the European Union members. As it relates to the United States AGOA, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunities Agreement, it also does that. It throws the African continent backwards as it seeks to perpetuate a new colonial setup on the African continent that continues to benefit this former, well, in the case of the European Union, the former colonizer, in the case of the United States, seeking to maintain the dominant hegemonic role on the African continent. And that's why we're arguing that China's penetration on the African continent has offset this kind of relationship. And as we speak, China is now, by all accounts, the largest trading partner of many of the African continent, many of the African countries on the continent. And this has not set well with authorities and policymakers in both Europe and in the United States. And in this current, in the last couple of years or so, we would have seen that there's an increased militarization of the African continent. The establishment of the Africa Command itself is part of that expression, but also that the US has had, in the last period, many military exercises with countries on the African continent and doing training and other things on the African continent. This is part of an endeavor to try and source and carry favor with African countries and African leaders and continue its dominance on the continent. The US has the largest sophisticated military technology, not only in non-personnel artillery that's around on the African continent. It also has built massive, frightening embassies whose purpose, one could argue, is not so much political and diplomatic relations with African countries, but stands out as this massive, colossal threat to African countries. And much of the work that they do in these embassies and consulates across the African continent is to do counterintelligence and other such related technologically advanced endeavors. France, as we said earlier on, continues to no colonial relationship with West Africa, and continues to be in charge, so to speak, of the important policy instruments in West Africa. For much of West Africa, African countries, they do not have the fiscal policy instruments in their hand, because France prints and supplies money or currency for these countries, and the fiscal policy instruments that are taken away from much of West Africa, and as a result, they're unable to assert their sovereignty and progressive democratic decision-making in those countries. And this is not to suggest that China's penetration on the African continent has no critique. It does. It has a positive critique. But that has been spewed out, in particular from academic institutions and others in the United States and in Europe, is actually set as a basis to buttress the continued uneven relationship that both European Union and the United States seeks to perpetuate on the African continent. The African continent has benefited in the last few, 2 or so decades since China's return in the post-Deng Xiaoping opening up period, and go out, Jiang Zemin's go out policy. We've seen China investing in infrastructure, in many other important projects on the African continent. And now with the One Belt, One Road initiative, there's real potential for a mutually beneficial relationship between the African continent and China itself. The African continent continues to be weighed down by the debt to multilateral institutions that are propped up by a policy regime that comes from the United States and Europe, and as such, it's not tuned for the conditions of the African continent and for a development trajectory that supports ordinary people and equal development as we want to argue. We think China-Africa relations have a good potential going forward. China's recognizing in this period, especially as a result of the initiatives of the One Belt, One Road, that there are important initiatives to be undertaken on the continent, not only through an extractive process, but building a mutually beneficial relationship that builds and also cultivates the manufacturing base on the African continent and many such other things. China is also involved in many other initiatives on the African continent, peacekeeping initiatives that are important for the continent. We're mentioning these things because they are important in order to offset the kinds of things that Jody was saying about the narrative that emerges from the United States and Europe, and for the reason and the rationale that both the European Union and the US present to try and nudge out China from the African continent. And that's why we argue that there are tangible and material things that the African population and African peoples can benefit in a mutual, respectful relationship between China and the African continent itself. We think over the years, with the development of FOCAC itself, the Forum for Africa-China relationship, its focus has now begun to relate to key important questions that relate to people's development, whereas in the past it used to focus on the African ruling elite. We think with the views that are coming through, with the exchanges that are having with authorities in China, there's better appreciation of other voices other than the ruling elites, and it's important to sustain a relationship between ruling parties and etc. But we're also arguing that there are other voices that must be taken into consideration so that we enhance the relationship that is being built. You will know that in South Africa, COSATU has been very vocal about anti-dumping regulations that has, in a way, been a bit destructive to our own textile industry in South Africa. And we have brought this to the attention of the Chinese, and they've appreciated that. And we're building we want to argue something very beneficial for both of us. And that's why we support, my last point, that's why we support the One Belt, One Road initiative. Innately, it has huge potentials for a new civilization, for a new understanding, for a new appreciation of multilateralism and mutual beneficial initiatives that sustain humanity and that sustains life. And this is important for us to roll back that narrative of the United States and the European Union imperialist, whose only agenda on the African continent has been to reverse democracy, sovereignty that has been gained some 50 years or so ago. Thank you very much, Comrade Vijay. Thank you very much for the opportunity.